Women's Agenda for Change evolved because of a group of women, including myself, that had been working in Cambodia for quite some time during the UNTAC, which was the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, where overnight the socialist system changed to a capitalist system and there was a preparation for the elections to take place. And in this time, we saw so many NGOs emerging, so many NGOs coming into the country, and it was really quite a circus with all the cargo coming into the country, and it was quite a shock to the people there. But in addition to that, there were 22,000 UN peacekeeping troops there. And so we also saw around Phnom Penh the emergence of the entertainment industry and brothels virtually overnight established in different parts of Phnom Penh. And we were concerned about who these women were that were coming to work in the brothels. What part of Cambodia were they coming from? Why were they pushed and pulled out of the rural areas and coming into the cities to work in the brothels? And what was the situation for them? What were they experiencing? What was the level of exploitation or not happening at the time? And so we started to develop programs to help these women. And one of those programs eventually was the Women's Agenda for Change, because we really believed that the only way that women were to make a change or to have a voice was for these social groups themselves to be organised and have self-determination and agency. So they themselves would tell the newly formed government and the organisations and all the development agencies that were coming in with what their ideas were for a better Cambodia, that they could actually participate in those debates and talk about what they wanted and what they saw was best for them. One of the social groups that we started to work with and build relationships with were sex workers. And remember that at the time there was the context of HIV as well, and that was a problem. And sex workers were seen at that time not only as being bad women and not following the Cambodian ideal of what a good woman was, but they were also seen as the vectors of disease. So they were blamed also for the spread of HIV and all the collateral damage and manifestations of what that meant for families, of course. And so we decided that it was time that we would gather sex workers and hear from them what it is that they should do in order to combat not only the prevention of HIV amongst them, but also to address the exploitative elements and the criminal elements that existed in the sex industry at that time. So just to be clear, we weren't looking at, redirecting them into what would be deemed as better jobs, but we were looking at what were the exploitative elements that existed and how they could find strategies and tools and resilience to combat that. And so we started working with a group of sex workers, and I remember in the early days, in 1998 and 1999, the first group that we formed, and they became the core group that were elected by a bigger group of sex workers, 90% of them died from HIV. So then we had to start again. So what that meant was a lot of capacity building and a lot of training and a lot of programs aimed at helping them to reform themselves. And so over time that happened, and in 2000 and 3, they were able to establish their own organisation, and at that time they called it a union, so it was very much established and operated as a union where they would have elections, they would have mobilisers at a commune level where they would be talking to the broader groups of women that were working in the sex industry, and coming up themselves with ways that they wanted to see better conditions for sex workers in Cambodia. And they were quite successful in doing this. You know, they were able to mobilise a substantial amount of women. They were able to lobby for laws that were not punishing and punitive to women in the sex industry. They were able to build relationships with the police, who were previously those who brutalised them. They were able to establish links to health providers. They were able to also have programs for the children of sex workers, so they could also transition into state schools and not miss out on an education. So mostly they were able to achieve quite a lot. I mean, I think one of the biggest achievements that they were able to make was to be able to reduce HIV infection in Cambodia, and this effort was even recognised by UNAIDS, at the very highest levels, because Cambodia was quite praised for their ability to be able to keep the HIV prevalence in the country below 3.6. And
what about the education levels of the sex workers? How did they have to become more literate and stuff to do this kind of work, or did you have to help them with that, or what?
Some sex workers chose to learn literacy and numeracy in Khmer. Others chose even to go beyond that and learn basic English. But to be an organiser and to have a voice and to be able to, gather a critical mass of sex workers to demand change and demand human rights doesn't require an education, because they were able to tap into the support of the Women's Agenda for Change, and much later to tap into the support of other organisations that also became their allies. So if you needed someone that could critique a law, or you needed someone that could write a policy document, there's many of them. That wasn't the main part of their work, and it wasn't the main part of their concern. The main part of their concern was to eliminate the criminal elements and the exploitative elements of their work, so they could work with dignity, safety, and have access to health and education just like every other citizen in the country, and not be discriminated against. It was very much a grassroots organisation, because what the Women's Agenda for Change did is that they just worked with a small group of sex workers, and those sex workers also had access to understanding how trade unions work, for example, and of course they knew the terrain of the brothels and the sex industry, because they were part of that. So they were out there organising the women and making it, mobilising them and ensuring that there was a relevance and a reason why women should join their movement, why other sex workers should join the movement, and what are the benefits that they could get out of that, and how, as a critical mass, that they could make those changes that were impacting on them and destroying not only their ability to make a livelihood, but destroying their sense of worth as human beings because of the stigma and the discrimination. And one of the most well-known international examples of that was when there were attempts for a US-based drug company with an American university and an Australian university to conduct drug trials on prevention of HIV. And that was really a time where we saw, you know, most sex workers band together to oppose participating in this drug trial, because when they were listening to what this entailed, they did not feel that this was good for them. And so they opposed it, and this was a victory that was then brought to the rest of the world, and of course touted as something quite extraordinary, that a bunch of Cambodian sex workers, whether they could write or not was irrelevant, they were able to stop unethical trials. And, you know, by the virtue of stopping those trials, saved a lot of women from eventually becoming HIV positive and dying.
Do you remember the name of the drug?
Yes, it was tenofovir, which is an ingredient that is found in antiretroviral drugs, and they were trying to test it as a tablet to prevent HIV, and these tests did occur in other countries in Africa, and women did die. And because in those other countries in Africa, and Cameroon was one of them, did not have a very strong, mobilised and organised sex worker collective, they were not able to stop this trial taking place like Cambodia. In fact, Cambodia was the only country in the world where they held this trial where sex workers were able to bring it to a halt. So it never took place. In 2000, when we were relocating, the Women's Agenda for Change was relocating an office, so we were breaking away from Oxfam Hong Kong, and we were looking for our own office. I asked all the staff to jump in our car, and we went over to the riverside, and I said to them, see that over there? That's going to be our new office. And they all said to me, we can't have that in Cambodia. People will not respect us, they will laugh at us. This is a restaurant, it's a brothel, it's a dancing place. We can't have our office there. And I said, like hell we can't. If we're going to work with sex workers, if we're going to work with garment workers, if we're going to host them, then we're going to have this office as our office. And so it was this extraordinary flotilla, probably about 1,000 square metres, and downstairs was the family that owned the boat, but in the past it was where the rooms were, where the dancing girls could take their clients downstairs for selling of sex. So I think we were the only office in Cambodia that had this rule, no selling sex on this boat. And so that was quite it was quite confronting for a lot of people that worked with NGOs, but it was absolutely necessary. We had a dance floor, we had a crystal ball, we even had disco lights. And every now and again, when things got really tough and we watched so many of our friends and comrades die of HIV, we would just turn off the computers, the music would go on, and we would just dance and dance, and everybody would join in. What happened in 2008 was really a year that marked a tragic moment in history for Cambodian sex workers. Why? Because up until then, sex work was not criminalised. So sex workers could, albeit difficult conditions at times, but they were able to conduct their business and work and earn a living and contribute to the betterment and the social mobility of their siblings and supporting their families back in the villages. And in 2008, because of US pressure, and this pressure came from lobbyists in the United States, and unfortunately people that call themselves feminist, that believe, or wrongly and unjustly, that all sex work is equated with rape and the exploitation of women and no choice and no agency. So when the word sex work it conjures up slavery for a lot of these lobbyists, and unfortunately this wrong perception and dangerous perception then is adopted by American NGOs, and it becomes embedded in policy that is forced upon countries that are recipients of USAID. How does this work in reality? So as a poor country like Cambodia that relies on foreign aid and foreign loans that come from bilateral funds, these countries place conditions. Part of those conditions is judicial reform. Part of judicial reform is legislative changes. One of those legislative changes that was forced on Cambodia in 2008 was to criminalise sex work, under the guise of wanting to save women in a law on the suppression of trafficking of women and children. Now, trafficking is very different to women working in the sex industry, consenting as adults to engage in sex work. Unfortunately, for a lot of these policymakers, lobbyists and international agencies, whether there is a religious agenda or not, there's definitely a moral judgment that takes place, and in reality it manifests itself that all these NGOs want to save women from rape. And so these women, the very ones that they claim and use moral arguments and unfortunately co-opt human rights debates that they want to save, they are actually putting them in very dangerous circumstances and very dangerous conditions, and they are driving them underground so they have even less access to health and other services that they require, and they're basically allowing for the state to brutalise them and commit violence against them. And this is what we saw, a proliferation of violence that is justified under this immoral idea that we are saving these women from rape and sexual exploitation. Nobody ever asked these women, do you want to be saved? Nobody ever asked them that. Nobody has ever given them the dignity that they do have agency. They just want respect and they want autonomy. And that's what feminism is about, respecting the choices of women and allowing that self-determination and autonomy. Yet these lobbyists use feminist debates and human rights arguments to actually put sex workers in very dangerous situations where you start seeing the killing of sex workers because it allows that level of violence to occur.
How do the sex workers feel about feminists from the West, for example, and other countries, taking that position against sex work?
How the sex workers feel, they are already discriminated against. they already have a very low status in their society. They are already stigmatized. They are already facing precarious situations. So when you have these people from the West coming there and saying, oh, you poor thing, this is terrible what you're doing, this is terrible what is happening to you, they just feel even further discriminated against. They feel even further humiliated, and they feel that they are worthless and less than human. In fact, very often they say, do they think we are human? Because nobody actually ever considers them to be equal human beings. And they always say, why do these people come to us and talk about human rights when they don't think that we should have human rights, that we should have women's rights? Because they tell us that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. They're telling us that what is happening is wrong and that we should be doing something else. So they have no respect for us as humans, that we shouldn't have any rights in what we do.
Do you know anything about the manipulation of trafficking statistics in order to raise charity money?
Look, I started working on the issue of trafficking in the late 80s and early 90s, and I can absolutely attest to the fact that there were very, very few organisations that were even talking about trafficking. In fact, we didn't even use the word trafficking. We were talking about slave-like conditions because we hadn't even articulated and defined what that meant. So I was actually part of that whole discourse and paradigm development. What we saw the dangers happen is that then in the 90s and in the early 2000s, there was so much money that organisations, international organisations, local organisations, multilateral institutions were accessing because they were claiming that they were going to stop the trafficking of women and children. And of course, in order to access this money, you've got to create the idea that there is this incredibly huge problem and that people, women and children, are being trafficked all the time, and we have to, get this money in order to stop this happening. But in actual fact, that really is disrespectful to those people that really are trafficked. Trafficking is a very complicated process that a lot of Western organisations really don't understand. I remember going to the detention centres in Thailand in the border and actually talking to Cambodians who had been so-called trafficked or caught in Thailand working. Only one of them, one out of the 156 people, was a woman, a 22-year-old, that had agreed to go to Thailand to work as a sex worker. What she didn't agree to was to then be treated and kept in slave-like conditions. So her salary was withheld. She had no agency and no decision and no choice into how many customers that she serviced and who and all the rest of it. And that's where this is really problematic. So she had agreed to work, but she didn't agree to the conditions that she found herself in. Yet a person who is anti-trafficking would say, oh, she's a slave and she was snatched in the middle of the night and she was, taken over the border into Thailand and thrown into a brothel in Thailand and repeatedly raped. It's not as black and white as that. It's a lot more complicated. I spoke to people that went to Thailand to work as beggars. And some of them had been rounded up and put into the detention centres at least 5 times. And I said to them, why do you keep going? You know that this is bad for you. You're telling me that, you're suffering these terrible, humiliating experiences. And they said to me, it's worth it, because what else have we got to do? Maybe the next time we'll get lucky. So it's very complicated. It's been a very lucrative funding for a lot of organisations. It appeals as a fundraising tool because everyone has these images of women being taken from their beds at night and put into brothels. And so it has a mass appeal. But more importantly, it's also being used to stop migration, to stop porous borders from one country to another. So it's also about controlling people movement. And that's the more sinister but very real side of trafficking. The WNU, the Women's Network for Unity, has gone from strength to strength to strength despite the 2008 law on criminising sex work in Cambodia, but they've still gone from strength to strength. They are considered a legitimate organisation that represents sex workers in Cambodia. They are the legitimate voice of sex workers in Cambodia, and also internationally. They are a member of the international networks. On a day-to-day basis, they are helping sex workers who, in the course of their work, are rounded up by the state authorities, such as the police, and put into what is called rehabilitation centres, or rehabilitation centres that are run by not-for-profit organisations that are saving sex workers or think that they are saving sex workers. And they have now grown to such an extent that they are able to hire a lawyer, so they also have legal representation. They sit on very high and influential bodies that have government representation from the Ministry of Health. They are respected by multilateral organisations like the World Health Organization. They participate in policy development and policy review when it comes to health and access to health for sex workers. And seriously, 15 years ago, if you said to anyone that sex workers would have this much representation and part of so many crucial platforms that are to improve the lives of sex workers and to input in shaping what that service delivery to sex workers looks like, people would think that you were daft, that would never happen in a country like Cambodia. And really that is a testament to their resilience and a testament to their ability to grow and grow their movement, and they are a voice to be reckoned with. They are a voice that even the Prime Minister of Cambodia will hear. Sometimes he ignores it, but sometimes he hasn't ignored it. So they are very influential. They go to international conferences, sharing experience with other sex worker movements, a lot smaller than them. They provide inspiration to so many people, and they will never allow sex workers to be brutalised and forgotten. They will fight in the courts, and they fight at the police stations, and they will fight through the media, and they will fight in the streets. But they have become a voice that stands for sex work and sex workers, and they demand that what they do, while they are doing it, it deserves to be recognised as work, and therefore labour rights, women's rights and human rights are also for them. Because the Women's Network for Unity has such a large membership and they represent so many sex workers, up to 6,000 sex workers, and they have been working for over a decade now, and they've built this credibility with government and government departments, and they are card-carrying members, they are actually able on a day-to-day basis walk into a police station if one of the sex workers has been arrested and has contacted them through the hotline. They're able to go into a police station with a lawyer that works for the Women's Network for Unity and negotiate for that sex worker to be freed. They are able to enter into the Ministry of Social Development and their rehabilitation centres, and they're able to monitor what is happening with any of the girls that have been taken to the rehabilitation centre and negotiate their release. If there is resistance at that level, because of their standing, they are able to access higher level, and in Cambodia this is very important, support to have those women released. They are also able to access medical support to the women. Previously they would take sex workers that were very ill to the hospitals and they would be ignored, but because they've been able to develop this relationship with the Ministry of Health and in particular hospitals in various areas, they actually access medical attention and sometimes cut through the bureaucratic red tape and get that help immediately for their members or for any sex worker. So increasingly the sex workers more and more are wanting to be part of this network because they can see the practical day-to-day. If someone dies even, they can help with funerals. If someone's kid needs to go to school, they can even help with getting them access to a school. They can help with housing, they can help with transport. So there are so many ways that they can help sex workers. But I do want to say that there are very few sex worker organisations anywhere in the world that I know of that actually hires a full-time lawyer. The Women's Network for Unity was the first sex worker union to establish a legal clinic just for sex workers. I have often been criticised from Western feminists and also feminists from the Global South. They've criticised me they said that I promote sex work, that I promote the exploitation of women, and how dare I call myself a feminist. And so my response to them is, how dare that you think that feminism and women's rights and human rights is selective, and it's not for all women. It's only for women who are not using their bodies to generate income for themselves and their family. And I also respond to them that your judgment is anti-feminist. I don't judge these women. Yes, what the industry that they work in is exploitative, but there's a lot of industries that are exploitative. For example, the carpet industry in India exploits child labour, but we don't ban carpets. We need to ban what is exploitative about these industries. But fundamentally, when people say that to me, it just exposes their class, because they have never been put in a position where they've had to consider working as a sex worker.